All right, in this video, I want to specifically talk about the ambient occlusion map and then some of the things that can happen when you bake it. And I'll go a little bit more in depth and show you why that is. But oftentimes the ambient occlusion map isn't perfect right out of the gate, okay? Like something like the normal map can be because we used all our mesh names and stuff like that. So the ambient occlusion map is a pretty important map. In Substance Painter, you can use it to generate a lot of things. So that can be useful too, not only as a map that you can plug in into Unreal. For those that don't know, it's a high quality shadow map that's caused by things getting close to each other, occluding, so light can't get in there. So that type of shadow is really hard to do in real time. Pretty much any kind of ambient occlusion shadows that would happen in a real-time renderer would be, trickery of, some degree. It's not going to be like a ray trace renderer. In a ray trace renderer, you just get it. But even if you weren't using it, getting the ambient occlusion data can really help when creating certain texture effects, like dirt in the cracks and edges and things like that. So it's an important map. Oftentimes it can be messed up. Yours might be messed up depending on your bake setup. So let's jump over into Substance Painter right now and talk a little bit about why it might not be perfect and what we can do to fix it inside of Substance. Okay, so here we are inside of Substance Painter. And if we take a look at just the ambient occlusion map, full screen, let's take a look at some stuff here. So overall, it's pretty good. Some things don't make a little bit of sense, like over here. Right here, you're seeing shadows and nothing is there. That's just because I have the high poly there to create the shadows. You just can't see it. So I want the shadows from that. Over here, same deal. So we're not having the low poly there because we can just mirror it. But the high poly is there to create the shadows. But here you can kind of see a little mistake right here. And a big one is the pearls. Like it's black here and we don't want that. So what I would want to do is remove all these shadows. I don't need any ambient occlusion on the pearls. That's an easy one to fix. And then over here, this can illustrate kind of the issue that we can talk a little bit more in depth about. So what we're seeing here is this kind of interference, right? We're seeing it from this shape is casting onto this shape. Each of these, is kind of intersecting. Now, what makes the ambient occlusion map more susceptible to these interference issues is that by default, if we take a look in Painter, if we go over to the bake settings for this, in normal map, if we come down, you can see we have by mesh name on. Remember, that's the magic we use to match everything up, and that solves interference. We can just say this prop high poly matches this prop low poly. Ignore everything else. But if we go into ambient occlusion map, you can see self occlusion is on always and not by mesh name. Now that's what you want. That's why it's set up this way by default. Because if you could imagine over here, if we jump back into 3D, this ring right here would be matched up. They're the high and the low poly. That's what we want. And then this leather piece might be matched up to that high and low poly. Okay, that's what we want. Again, you get a clean bake of the normal map and everything without that interference. But what we want with the ambient occlusion is the shadows, right? And those shadows need to go across those objects because the whole point of an ambient occlusion map is that neighboring objects create shadows and we get that detail, we get that data, and we get all the nice stuff we can do with that. So that's why we're not going to ever use by mesh name, and that's also why exploding isn't as good as doing, things like by mesh name or any kind of filtering by object rather than like exploding the mesh apart into a bunch of pieces to avoid interference. We need meshes to be close together to get that real good ambient occlusion data. Okay, so all that to say this, now that we bake our ambient occlusion, there's going to be some things that we probably don't like that much. Like here's another example over here. Like maybe there's some kind of problem right here. That could be the back face poking through, So it just created a little blip here. So what we can do in Substance is we can edit our ambient occlusion map. That'll help us when we're looking at it. And then when we export them out, it's going to be our edited version. So let me walk you through the steps of doing that. It's a useful thing to know how to do. It'll teach you a little bit more about Substance, I think, too. Some things you might not be familiar with, maybe. And I'll show you how you can paint in and out and make your own custom ambient occlusion map using the one that you baked. All right, so the first step is we need to add an AO channel. Like if I were to just add a fill layer right now, you can see the channels I have on the left. Those channels on the left, none of them represent the ambient occlusion. So we don't really have anything to edit that. If I were to export the ambient occlusion right now as a channel, if I were ready to get these textures out of here and I didn't have a channel, it's just going to export the mesh map is what it's called, which is what we baked over here. That's what we were looking at. It would export this. So we need to be able to create a channel so we can edit it and that it can be put into the exporter so that when it exports, it's the one we want it to be. So to do that, we got to add another channel. Come over to texture set settings. There's a plus sign and we'll add ambient occlusion. You can see there's other ones here too. It defaults to L8. That's good. It's a grayscale map. Something to note is if I change to a different texture set, you can see I don't have that channel. So I would have to add this ambient occlusion channel to each texture set that I want to edit, the ambient occlusion of. If you add this and you just don't edit the ambient occlusion, it'll still export fine. So if you're not planning on editing anything in the texture set settings, there's really no downside here. Once I add that, if I jump back over to the headgear, you can see on the left now, I have an ambient occlusion channel, right, that I didn't have before. All right, the last little thing that we need to do is back in the texture set settings where we added it, you can see there's a place for ambient occlusion mixing and it's on multiply. And we want to change this to replace. Now, in case you're not familiar with multiply, multiply just means the darkness goes through. Like the darker the value, the more opaque. And then white would be completely transparent. You can't see white. I don't know why it defaults to that. It might just be because it's used to just people adding shadows. But the end result that we want to create a setup where I can just paint in and out, right? Like this black spot that we saw right here, right, on the ambient occlusion. I need to paint that white. I can't just paint black. I need to be able to paint all the values. So we're going to change the ambient occlusion mixing to replace. So that's the last change you need to do in the texture set settings. So now we'll add a fill layer. You see I already did that. I can just come up here and just add a fill layer and we'll just call it AO, all right, for ambient occlusion. Now if I hold Alt and I click AO, it'll be the only channel that is on this and you see it defaults to white. But as with everything, you can plug in a map here rather than just a straight value. So we're going to choose the ambient occlusion and we want it from the headgear, which is right here. So if I isolate this, there you go. Okay. So now you can see this is the mesh map that we baked and now it's in the fill layer and it's set to replace. So what we've done here is we did a different setup, but we have the same net result, but now we have it over here in the layer stack and now we can add a layer to edit it. Okay, so now what we can do is I'll zoom in so we can see a little bit more. So now we have this fill layer for our ambient occlusion. I'll just delete this to make this simple. So we have only one fill layer in this example. It's just doing ambient occlusion and it has our mesh map. Now I'm gonna add a paint layer. So now we can call this like, okay, how about AO painting? Okay, so now we can paint in and out. Now we'll scroll down here to the paint layer. You can see it's got all these channels. We just need AO again. So now this is gonna be the value that I'm painting. Now I'll just show you, if I just come in here and start painting, nothing's happening, right? If we go over to the ambient occlusion channel, you can see nothing's happening. That's gonna be a confusing thing to a lot of people. This is gonna hopefully soak in over time. If you're not familiar with this already, definitely take note of this. And if you are someone who understands this, you can see like you just get so much more control. But something that people kind of sometimes lose sight of is that over here in my layer stack, I have these two layers, but I'm looking at the base color. You can see there's this drop down menu here. Most of the time you are using base color, at least you're looking at it. You're editing all this stuff on the side, but you can see it's a checker right now, right? It means it's transparent. That's because there is no base color. We're just editing the ambient occlusion. So each of these layers has its own parameters that you can access per channel. So if I come up here and I go down to ambient occlusion, now you can see it's set to multiply, and that's not what we wanted. So we're gonna change this to normal. We just want to be a normal layer at the bottom, right there. This is the ambient occlusion baked map. Just make it a AO. You can set it to replace even, but this should be fine. Then we can change the normal painting, just paint layer to normal, so that it's just a layer, and there you can see. So like all I'm doing with this layer is I'm painting the values of our ambient occlusion. So here's white. Right, I can press 2 on my keyboard to get an eraser and erase back. So now I'm able to paint ambient occlusion values right on top of my baked map so that in here I can fix anything. And then I have all the tools, you know, normally. But if I wanted to come in here and try to fix this, right? You come in here, do a little bit of this. So this could be how we could do some, you know, little editing, just so like these big blemishes don't stand out. So if I press M to go back to material mode, there you go. We don't have this like big blemish right there, right? And so that's how we would fix some of this stuff. Even here with the ropes, you can see it doesn't matter, but I can fix some of this stuff too. If I go to C for channel, we're gonna be seeing the ambient occlusion. Now, one more little note here, that's a substance painting thing. We come in here. If I go down to mesh maps, these are the maps that we baked, remember? If I'm looking at ambient occlusion in the mesh map, then it's not gonna change. It's not gonna show me the combination that I'm making. I have to go to these channels to see the different channels. So there you go. So it looks like I painted through a lot of stuff here for some reason. So you be careful when I paint it through. There you go. So now you can see it just covers that little blemish. We could make this a little bit more complicated and give us more options if we just made a folder and call it, you know, the AO folder, and then call this AO bake. So that's the fill layer. Put this inside of a folder now. I'll make this folder pass through because I just want everything to go through. This folder is just a container. I want it to just be a collection of layers that I can just collapse and I know what it is. So pass through essentially just makes it like an empty container. Now I can add some more stuff. So like now I could add a fill layer and call it AO white, right? So if I go to AO and just make it white, set it to normal, boom. Now all of my AO is white. That's not what I want, but it's good now that I have this, I can add it wherever I want. So if I added a black mask by right clicking, I can add a paint layer, and we're gonna do this a bunch coming up. So this is just a preview. But now I can come over here to this tool. This lets me do different kinds of fills like polygon fill, UV island fill, and this is a mesh fill. So right now what's going on is I have a layer that's just white ambient occlusion value, right? And it's set to normal, so it's just on top of my bake map. Now I've created a black mask so you can't see anything. And now I'm gonna paint into that mask by selecting some objects. So if I wanna just get rid of the ambient occlusion on this pearl, I can just click the pearl and there you go. So I can copy this folder, jump over to the mantle, paste it. And what's super cool about Substance Painter is it's smart enough to replace the ambient occlusion right here that we had in our fill layer. It replaced it with the mantle one. It didn't use the one from the other one. Does that make sense? So like I was on headgear and I chose the headgear AO. When I pasted it into the mantle texture set, it just knows, you know, he's gonna want the AO from this one. So I love that. So now we just painted our little setup here. I can get rid of this because, you know, we don't need to be painting on that. I'm gonna get rid of this paint. So we just have a clean setup. I can add a paint layer here. Now I can come over here and make sure that I just want all this to be white too. Oops, there we go. I don't need AO on these pearls. Ambient occlusion is on multiply, replace. There we go, there we go. So just to show you before and after, this is what it would be when I baked it, and I just fixed it by just making it all white. So that's how you set up the layers so that you can just paint in and out. I did this a few times with my character just to clean things up. It gives you the most control. And so however fine detailed or how many touch-ups you want to do is kind of up to you. I think it's useful to show the material view so you can just see, you know, most of the time, even in Unreal Engine, the ambient occlusion map, unless there's a really stark mistake contrast, if it's just like little stuff like this, it's going to be fine. You know, like this little interference from these twisted ropes is fine. It is up to you how detailed you want to be. But what's cool about creating a setup like this in Painter is we stayed inside of Painter. We didn't have to leave. And now we have complete full control over our occlusion map. We get the best of both worlds, that we get the bake, and then just by using normal paint brushes and normal layer stuff, we can touch it up. It's non-destructive. You can touch it up throughout the whole process. You know, by all means, like once we get into the rendered view, you can see, you know, if there's any touch up needed or not. All right, that is how you can edit your ambient occlusion map inside of Substance Painter and do whatever you want to do to make it as perfect as you want to make it. Now that we have our ambient occlusion all touched up, now we can jump into blocking out the textures, layers, and materials we think we're going to need for our whole texturing project. So let's do that now.